And we're live.
Okay, hello and welcome to another Biotensegrity party with Levin Blyum's Everything I Know series with Stephen Levin. This is episode 8, Spreading the Biotensegrity Message. My name is Graham Scarr and I'm part of the Biotensegrity Archive, organises the Biotensegrity parties. And together I'm joined with my co-host, Susan Lowles-Salazno.
Hey there, coming to you from Washington, D.C.
And Chris Clancy.
Hi, everyone. I'm coming to you from Deep Cove in the unceded territory of the Coast Salish Nation.
Okay, we're about to start, and we usually start with a toast. So if you'd like to grab your favourite tipple and celebrate the beginning of another Biotensegrity party, always successful. Cheers.
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 While we're starting the video, perhaps if everyone would like to turn their videos off, it just makes the electronic Wi-Fi doobies work better, and then we'll come back on later for questions and answers.
Yes. Episode 8. Let's see. Share screen. Share sound. How's that look? Everybody see it?
It's almost there. Here we are, yes.
All right. See you on the other side.
Dear friends, we are continuing our Everything I Know series with Dr. Stephen Levin, and in the previous episode we really dived into the issues of the, like the story and the connection with the grandson method of anatomy. And previously I've shown you the 11th edition, which kind of looks sort of modernish, but this is, I think, 1980s. Yes, what is this? 1989, Williams and Wilkins. And here we are, right, seeing the one with all sorts of the, well, these are kind of prehistoric bookmarks, I would say, but they're tiny and neat. And here we are seeing the Grant's method of anatomy, well worn out, and the pages and so on. And let's look which year is this from, and what kind of edition is this. So, A Method of Anatomy, Descriptive and Deductive, J.C. Boyle Grant, and all sorts of the Professor of Anatomy in the University of Toronto, 5th edition, 950-52. So that's exactly from the times that you were at medical school.
Exactly,
So,
it was hot off the presses then.
So that's actually what you managed to, and here we are, right? Oh wow, look, page 79, the upper limb. Right, so and this is what we can see here, the upper limb, and that's this connective line. Okay, so here you talk about this. That was the question about part.
Yeah, well, yeah, he's showing a shear force here, and but then pushing against the scapula, which of course can't happen because that's a frictionless joint, unless you do, you'd have to do something weird.
You have to put the screw into it.
Right. I mean, it doesn't work.
Here we are. That's the one, right? So that's the method of anatomy, descriptive and deductive. So we're kind of touching history here, and my point is again to make the same thing. What I really wanted to highlight is that it's really interesting to see it from today's perspective. There is that at the time it didn't feel like anything revolutionary, right? So you see that connection, 1970s. Steve comes up with the understanding, and the tensegrity link. I can even say it, tensegrity link, right?
All right.
So, which links you to those tensional explanations that you had in those special cases for the shoulder girdle, pelvic girdle, and the forearm in the Grant's method of anatomy, like basically the functional anatomy at the time, right?
Right.
So, and then in between 1950s to 1970s, in between you had the experience with the newly forming and the newly forging biomechanics as the application of the engineering math to the body, and you were left dissatisfied with that.
That's correct.
So, and that's really a very simple thing.
Yes.
So you kind of got a broader, you took a relatively local and special case, tensional experience or the tensional line of reasoning that you got from Grant's method of anatomy, and then once you saw the tensegrity model, it just linked as a broader and better, more aggregate interpretation which kind of covers all of those but gives you a lot more.
Well, that's the way I approached it.
So, and in that respect, it didn't feel like anything revolutionary or groundbreaking or like toppling the authorities or anything like you were grabbing the red flag and trying to attack the barricades, right? So you said, because again, today that's how it feels, right? It's like, so this is really, really important in the way that we went through. But what I want to touch upon here, I really connected to the message that you had in the beginning, that you understood that that represented the spine, even though the direct similarity was not there. Now we're getting to the periphery, right? And in the periphery, this is a finer point, right? Because in the periphery, the first experience and the tendency to make the just a simple connection, this bone is a strut, this bone is a strut, and then, you know, like you got some sort of, you know, tensional connections between them, it's much greater, it's a much more tempting there. So I would like you to elaborate on this and how you kept this thing, you know, how you managed to keep this, well, what was your perspective? From the bones and muscles up or from their tensional integrity down? Let's put it this way.
I already had, from Grant, I already knew that there was a tensional system in the forearm at least, and also in the shoulder. So I knew that when we were talking about the limb, there were tensional forces that transmitted the loads differently than the compressional model that I was given. So I knew that. Which bone did what to whom was a real problem. So I didn't always understand that, but I understood when I had already then done the understanding that it had to be a hierarchical system, so that I knew that the bone itself was a tensegrity structure, at least in the model I was developing at the time.
Okay, so
I saw that the tensegrity that we saw as the bone was an integral part of a major tensegrity system, and that the bone itself had tensegrity within it, with meaning and had tension and compression elements.
okay, so that's a very important thing that we are touching upon here. So again, what I'm seeing here, I'm just hearing, like listening to you attentively. So what you said is that in general, even though Grant's anatomy itself, it's actually the system that comes up, takes the elements first, so it's a descriptive anatomy, and kind of ascends with the different forms of structural aggregation, but you actually took it more as a general principle, that what you said, you knew there were tensional links within the forearm which were different from the compressive transmission through the bones, but at the time you didn't know yet which particular details, but you were okay with that, so
Yes.
you took the general. So effectively what I hear here is that your perception of the limbs was similar to the perception of the spine. So taking the tensional continuity first, and then allowing yourself a space to figure out the details later.
Correct.
As opposed to, okay, this is the bone, and this is the, you know, this is where the exact muscle attaches, and then this is where the lines of pull are, and then let's calculate this and the moment's arm and so on. So you took it in a very general way to begin with, saying, okay, I'm looking at the tensional integrity as the first message, not as that what is the exact cable, what is the exact strut, and so on. And then the bone became their element within that tensional continuity. So that's very interesting. So let's elaborate on this. I mean, I'm really keen to hear this.
The other part of it is that when you look at this, there is an overlapping of the inferior and superior compression structure. And so I started looking.
Let's elaborate on this. What is the inferior and the superior compression structure?
Call it. So that there is this, for instance, this element goes below this element. You see, and so there's this kind of relationship where there's always a compression element that extends past the other compression element.
Okay, if we take the projectile.
Right.
So in that respect, if we were just putting them on a similar plane, so you see that in that respect there is a certain overlap when they're projected onto a plane.
Right.
Although, of course, in the 3D version, each of them takes its own line, and then like within a spiral they're being quasi-parallel to each other, right? But then, okay, you saw that...
There's this interdigitation where it's one is sticking between you.
Okay. Interdigitation. Okay, so that's a medical reference here, the word interdigitation. Okay.
So I would see, so I would look to see if that really existed. And I would always find in any joint that there was always a way of seeing that in a joint.
For example?
You take the glenohumeral joint.
Okay.
So you look at it, and then there's a clavicle that sticks out here, and another bone that sticks out here a little bit, and this protrudes up a little bit here. But it wasn't just one butting up against the other.
Okay, so that component of a certain overlap, that's what you were looking at.
Right. And
so
you look at the elbow joint, for instance, and it's not that the radius and ulna just push up against the humerus. There is a bit where the
ulna hooks behind,
and this one pushes this way, and the condyles of the bone have a shape where you can do that. And if you look at the knee joint, which is a harder one to see, but when you start playing around with it, you can see there's certainly this notch with the cruciate ligament going in it, and then there's a notch of the tibia that goes up into it. But then you have little things that nobody pays attention to, like the patella that sticks out in front, and then the fibula that comes up a little behind on the side.
Yeah.
And instead of just thinking of those 2 bones, I was thinking of those 4 bones.
I see your point.
So I was then being able to say, well, maybe there's more to it than I'm visualizing, and it's not so simple as one bone butting up against the other with a fulcrum.
Okay, so that is a very interesting point there, because so I see a number of like essential links there. So the first point, as you just gave the example with the knee, right? So you see, because we are kind of getting practical here, what would be there, like from the standpoint of the physical examination, right? So you see, what would be the practical difference in changing the perception of the knee? So first point was that what you're looking at is that it's looking at the irreversible volumetric representation, correct? Yeah. So that the fibula goes slightly behind, so that's where we've got the patella, so we've got the tibia and whatever the attachments that are coming medially, so that makes the total entity, and that entity is irreducible just to the straight load transfer, as it would kind of go as a coupling of the tibia and fibula, and then just the femur on top. So that's an interesting point. So that means that the minimal that you're looking there is that sufficient number of attachments that gives you the the irreducible 3D, you know, the 3D
Right.
volumetric thing.
And it's clear that, like the ankle joint, it's clearly that, where you see the fibula coming on one side and tibia on another side, and the talus fitting in between the two of them.
Mm.
So you see those overlapping things, and not only that, you can turn them in any direction, and that relationship always exists.
Okay, that's a good point, because you see, what I understand, the way that I understand it is that the way that we've been always, well, I mean, at least the conventional reasoning there about this type of overlaps, again, it's kind of patchy, but when it yields for convenient explanation, typically it would be something like this. Okay, you know, the fibula overlaps, but that means that it just protects it from tilting left or right.
Right.
So it would be a very simplistic, but it's still a compressional reasoning. So you kind of take it, you're blocking it from going left or right, and like, isn't it? So it's this sort of logic, right? So isn't it obvious that you need to restrict it as if you were having a sort of a Booten issue? So therefore, there you were taking the same observations, but looking at them not as just the limiting factors on the side, but actually taking them into the uniform representation, which would be more linked to this spiral and intrinsic, you know, tension distribution behavior within those tensegrity units.
In a sense, I was trying to invalidate this model, because I say, well, in order to have this model, I need these bones sticking past one another. And I look, and it was there.
Okay, I see.
So I was looking at it backwards in a sense. I said, well, you know, this model can't work if it's like this. And then I would see that I could see that relationship. And when I could see that relationship, I'd say, well, then maybe this model is possible.
Okay, so that's also, I mean, I find it's very interesting the way how this kind of transition between the aggregation and the, you know, the more abstract and the more concrete interplay works, right? Because on the one hand, you're taking this general idea of the tensional continuity with the irreducible volume, right? That's a very
Right,
important aspect of the
yes.
tensegrity, that you cannot reduce it there to a simple 2D representation. By reducing it to a 2D representation, you lose critical information. So that's one thing. But the second point, you know, if I sound a little bit more snobby mathematical, it's like, I must say that this type of the overlapping idea, I mean, personally, I would never come to it. You know, it sounds very medical to me, very sort of, okay, you know, like this thing overlaps here, you know. I said, well, true. This is, you kind of taking it really at face value and saying, well, you know, I'm not looking at some kind of fancy mathematics without it. I'm just looking at the, are there presences of the overlaps?
Right.
But what I also see there is because, in fact, what we're observing is that these tiny overlaps, they are one of the things which sort of creating some challenge, shall I say challenges, but from the biomechanics standpoint, biomechanics as the application of the engineering
Right.
equations, you have to deal with them. And meaning that either you have to assume that they're not there, or you sort of, you know, you sort of have to treat them the other way as very inefficient things, because if this is a fulcrum and they overlap just a little bit, then we have this classic trouble which started the whole challenge for you in the first place, right? So the person bending forwards, you've got that much of a tailbone sticking out over the behind the fulcrum, you got the 10x. So now the same thing, you've got the slight overlap of the shoulder blade, you know, here, and then you've got the same type of trouble. So you are seeing it not as the roof of the shoulder girdle, not as the, you know, like shoe restraint of the ankle, but plugging them into the model. So that's a very interesting thing here, which like really clarifies a lot. Okay, great. So that's the line. So that's the line of reasoning that you were really taking. But now let's see. So you're bringing this line of reasoning, connecting yourself to the grants method, and you're bringing this to the practitioners, right? So what has been happening there?
Well, amongst my colleagues, nothing.
Okay.
But I decided I would go big and actually try and present this at an international, at least a national meeting to, of people who were interested in this. So it turns out that there is an organization called this was the annual conference on engineering and medicine and biology.
Okay, let me see that. That's
That
okay.
was-
Shamrock Hilton, Houston, Texas. I'm wondering if Shamrock Hilton is still there. September 21, 23, 1981. So that was after your first 5-6 years of going through locally, so you decided to go big.
So I went big.
Okay, so 31st annual conference.
So they accepted me as a poster session there. Now, of course, these are jury things, and so you submit an abstract, and they accepted me as a poster session, and I did a poster session for them there, and you know, there's an abstract in their proceedings
Okay.
that I did. And what I did was, in a poster session, you stand around in a little booth, and people, I had models and things, and people would come and ask me questions, and I would try and answer the question.
Okay, and
Well, at that point, it became very interesting for me because
so that was your kind of first big experience, first
Yeah,
experience
that
on a bigger scale.
exactly.
But you already practiced your spiel a bit with
Well,
the
yeah, I was doing
locally to the local physical therapy group.
in Washington and Northern Virginia. I was already giving little spiels here and there, but nothing big.
So, but your first audience were physiatrists
Yeah, but
and physical therapists.
Yeah, I should go before that. The one other one I did, I told you I had gotten back into manual medicine with John Manel, and at that point I joined an organization called, it was a manual medicine, I'm trying to remember the name of the organization, I have it someplace, but it was a manual medicine organization where physicians, MDs and osteopaths, DOs, joined together to do manual medicine, and I started presenting papers there.
Ah, so it was American Association or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
We'll find it somewhere. Your membership
I have it
certificate.
right up there. It's one of the plaques.
Hmm.
Anyway, so I presented there, but this is a relatively small group of very specialized people doing manual medicine, and it got accepted there, so I got a chance to talk there. So that was my first bit, and I was probably in 1980, I probably presented there.
Mm-hmm.
And I might have it written down someplace. But the first one where I would challenge it outside my small community, let's say,
Yeah.
of people who knew me, was in this meeting. And at that point it was really interesting because it wasn't just orthopedic types.
But how did you, what was the name of this presentation? We'll have to look it up.
Yeah, you look it up, it was...
Okay, but what was it? It was some...
It was Tensegrity as a model for mechanics, I think. It was much more generalized as a...
Okay, we'll
Yeah.
find it later.
Yeah,
We'll find it
It's
later.
in there.
Okay. So it's an interesting design.
And I have the bigger journal on that.
Mm-hmm.
But it was more generalized, approaching Biotensegrity as a model for the whole system,
Mm.
as opposed to just the orthopedic system.
Okay.
And there would be physiologists would come to me as I'm talking, and they say, "What are you talking about?" I said, "What's your specialty?" He says, "Well, I'm a physiologist. I deal in respiratory physiology." I said, "Oh, here's a model of the lung."
Okay.
And I show, look, it expands and contracts just like the lung, and you expand it out, and it expands out, and then contracts down.
But what you had at the time, you had self-made Tensegrity models.
Yeah, right. And then someone would come to me and say, "Well, I'm a cardiac physiologist. He said, well, here's the heart pumping. You see, and I showed them how the heart was pumping, and I showed that this, So it was sort of interesting because all of a sudden I was no longer just talking to orthopedists. I was talking to physiologists in multiple fields in engineering, and they had accepted my paper, which was really very good. So all of a sudden I had entered into another field and expanded the whole concept. And at that point I was at that time I was doing it off the cuff. They would come up to me and I said, well, let me see how I can fit it into what they're asking about, and I just did it.
Okay, so you were flying by the seat of your pants.
Absolutely, but I had already recognized that this was not just an orthopedic thing because I had brought it up right from the cell all the way up.
Okay, so and over there were, because what I see here, it's a really broad engineering conference.
Oh yeah.
Including things like transducers, electrodes, and instruments.
Oh yeah, these were engineering.
Artificial organs, surgical devices, biosignal analysis and mechanics, and all orthopedics and biomechanics. So it's really was a broad conference here.
Right.
Microprocessor hardware applications, right? So it was like even before the personal computer that much, right?
Oh yeah, there was no personal computer then. So I was, so I was willing to bring this out and then I started just doing papers wherever I could, anybody accept the paper on it.
Okay, and but so you had this first talk there, first sort of dive or first exposure outside of your community, but so what you were happy about and what you were unhappy about? Like, how did the reality get with your expectations, or had you had any expectations, and how was the whole thing going that way?
Well, I was hoping that it would, be widely just there.
So that people will say, wow, thank you, Dr. Levin, let's say, isn't it such an obvious thing? We all agree.
Yeah, but the thing is, everybody I found out later that all these people work in very small worlds. You think that they have broad exposure to things, but actually each one is very concentrated and focused on one little thing that they're doing. And so they would come, and I would never get challenged, at least I never got challenged in any of these. They would say, oh, that's very interesting, and then go around about their business. And it wasn't many who really took off on it. Now, the people who in manual medicine, they accepted, and I ended up talking just about every year at the manual medicine meetings. But, so I was integrated into that thing, but from the standpoint of engineering, the engineers could care less.
So, and that was disappointing to you?
It was disappointing.
Because you wanted, so you actually thought that there would be, that they would be the ones who would be happy to get
I thought it would be very obvious to them, because I'd say, hey, look, here it is, very obvious. Somewhere during this period, now we're moving into the 80s, I found out about Don Enberg, who was doing this similar work on the cell. So I actually got some of his papers, and I actually corresponded with Don Enberg somewhere around 1989. I sent him the papers I had done on gross anatomy and things beyond the cell, and he sent me a bunch of his papers that were about the cell. So we sort of began to but until then he was purely cell, and I was, well, I recognized from the cell up, but I wasn't involved in the cellular structure. So he was involved in the subcellular structure, and I was sort of involved from the organism concept. But we corresponded at that time, somewhere probably in the late 80s.
And then?
Well, then he kept doing his cell stuff, and I kept doing my stuff. So, but I've kept, I started going to all these conferences, mostly not orthopedic conferences, but engineering conferences. So I would present at these very engineering conferences, and they would get interesting results. Now, somewhere along the line, also in the 80s, I started talking. At that time, my wife that I was married to was a social worker.
Mm-hmm.
And I was sitting and talking to her one day at lunch or dinner, and I was telling her what I was doing, and she says, "Well, you sound like you're doing system science." I said, "What's that all about?"
Mm-hmm.
She says, "Well, in social work, there's this concept of system science where everything sort of interconnects, and there's a guy named Biotensegrity who presented that."
Oh, so the actual Biotensegrity presented there.
Well, no, he just talked.
Yeah,
She
because
talked
he was
about-
already very,
Right.
should have been very old. I mean, I don't
Probably.
remember when he died.
Well,
but,
she talked about Biotensegrity, so I got his book and I read his book and I said, "Oh, that's fascinating stuff." I
Mhm.
said, and it fits right into this concept of from cell to organism
Mhm.
as a systems rather than as separate things. So I said, okay, let me look into system science. So I started looking around system science, and lo and behold, one of the people involved in system science just happened to be here in Northern Virginia at George Mason University. So I called him up and I told him what I was doing, and he says, "Well, what you do is submit a paper to the System Science Society, and we'll see if you can get in there." So that's what I did.
And?
I got into system science. And not only did I,
So you attended their meetings as well?
I not only just attended, I presented at their meetings.
Okay.
And not only did I I learned system science from, for instance, Timothy Allen, who later was president of the society.
Mm-hmm.
But he was actually one of my first sort of mentors through system science, and he actually chaired the first the first lecture I gave in the section I gave,
Mm-hmm.
and was very supportive of it.
Okay.
So, but all of a sudden I became a system scientist.
All right.
And recognized that what I was doing was really system science and understanding the body, the structural relationships as a system rather than as an individual, as a local problem. So then I studied system science with Timothy Allen and others, and involved in this. And
But Timothy Allen, he wrote some books and...
yeah, he wrote a book and actually included 10 pages in the book on my work.
Oh, wow.
And
find
that's around down there.
It's in some this file.
For the
Okay.
unified ecology. He was
Towards unified ecology. It's at the bottom here.
nationally recognized. He was a professor in
Complexity in ecological systems
Right.
towards a unified ecology, Timothy Allen, Steve Levin, MD.
Yeah, and he has a whole section on tensegrity in there, which include my drawings. And
Oh,
my
so
work.
this is 1992, I see.
Yeah.
Actually, the books became a lot more expensive between the 1970s and so on. So
Right.
that's a $45 book, already.
Right.
So, okay,
Yeah,
so...
but it came out in '92, but I had worked on it with them for a long time before that, and I said a whole.
Okay, so Levin Stephens, 174, 184 pages, 174, 184. Okay, I can see that you read this book, I can see this.
Yeah, but those are my drawings. you
Yeah,
see.
yeah, that's it, I see this.
It's not that he took my drawings and went
Yeah.
through the whole system. That
Yeah,
I
so he references you throughout the entire book. So the basic structural units in organisms, the organism criterion, the triangles are not only one-dimensional structures which are the only two-dimensional that do not deform under pressure. Okay, so this is icosahedrons. Well, I see. So that's strain and stress. Typical. Okay. So that's that's been a long time ago. 1992, so that's the publishing, so that means that it probably went into, so that's like at least 1990, so it's like 30 years ago.
Yeah, and not
And
that,
you've been communicating with them for 5-7 years prior to that.
Exactly.
Wow.
So, you know, for 5 years before that, I was working and with him on and off, and we would, you know, he had me lecture, and actually he invited me to a couple of his to a couple of things at the University of Wisconsin where I taught.
So Columbia University Press. Okay, great. So these were interesting inquiries, but I see that you were actually, as you were going on, you were broadening the scope, and at the same time, I would say that that's, you know, that as far as I can see, or historically, that's where especially with the proliferation of the computers, there are a lot of new scientific methods and the new trends which started to appear as well. So, like, how did it feel like? You know, what was it? Then 1980s in this whole field, and
you know, but as I said, once I got into that system science thing, I understood this in a much broader concept.
So that was a big leap for you.
That was a major leap. Well, I had already been working as a system scientist without knowing it. Because I had already said, well, this starts with Ingberg stuff in the cell, it works up to the organism where I'm working, you see, and it covers the whole spectrum, and it just doesn't cover humans, it covers all creatures great and small. So, you know, and as I put right in one of my very early papers, from viruses to vertebrates, there's systems and subsystems. I knew it from in the early 1980s. I knew that it was a systems kind of concept. So I never just sort of isolated it as just a orthopedic thing that I was taking care of the joints with. It was throughout the system. And once you understood it as a systems thing, then you understand that at any level it has to be able to plug into the system. So any explanation that you do at any level always has to work back into the system and be compatible with the whole system.
Okay, but so since I would assume that most of our viewers are not, you know, obviously heard of the word system, but you know, even the name of Ludwig von Bertalanffy doesn't, you know, ring many bells. You know, could you like maybe make some links and just, you know, get some mini primer on what were the things that struck the most with you and resonated the most? And
the easiest mini primer for everybody is the electrical system. All right, so you pick up a book and you want to read it and it's dark, and you go to an engineer, he says, here's a flashlight to read the book. And he said, wait a minute, I have a whole house full of people who want to read books, and I got a refrigerator and electrical things that I would like to look to. He said, okay, we'll give you a generator for your house. So that becomes, all of a sudden your house becomes the systems that attack to the generator. And then you find out that the generator is very inefficient, not only that, your neighbor's very jealous, and they want to get hooked into the system too. So all of a sudden you've got a network in the neighborhood that works in it. But that works off a power station that's out someplace out, you know, a mile or two away. And then that hooks into a major grid. That one hooks it into the East Coast grid, which then hooks into the whole United States grid. So it becomes not only all linked together, but a failure somewhere out in East Oshkosh, Wisconsin, might affect what's going on right here.
But on the other hand, vice versa, from the robustness standpoint, your local failure is going to be saved by the redistribution from the...
Exactly, the whole system integrates into one another. Not only that, but things have to be stepped down and stepped up so everything matches. So that if I have say a European plug on my light, it won't work because it doesn't fit into the system. You see, or if it's a 220 and it fits in a 110 system, it's not going to work.
So the system has its
So
requirements
the system
and the
has to,
certain capacities on which it's
Right,
running, which are consistent throughout
and
the
you
system.
have to fit things into the system that you develop and work up and down the scale through all the
So
systems.
so getting back to us in that respect, right? So I think that that's an important thing to connect. So when we're actually talking about the systems, this is the big leap because it makes a move from this kind of patchwork. Okay, here we take the tensional, the tensional explanation for the shoulder girdle, but we happily will plug in the compression system into the spine. Well, we don't really know why this thing, and then the chest wall. Okay, the chest wall is going to be the casing that protects the lungs. Well, the head is hard.
Right.
That is probably just to protect the brain. And well, the stomach is soft. But that's because they wanted to breathe, and and that would be a patchwork of different logics,
Right.
which are just kind of each of them sounds okay, but on the other hand, together, it's like taking 220, 110, European plug, like diesel generator, and at the same time all
Right.
together. So I think that that's a very important thing to highlight, that with it, what is the beauty and the the essential property of the tensegrity models, the tensegrity approach. Again, I think that to feel it, we really have to open the brackets all the time and say it's not tensegrity in that sense, it's tensional integrity, right? So you see, it's the highlight the thing, right? It's a tensional integrity that we are applying the uniform treatment through all of them. So if it's in the elbow, if it's in the wrist, it has to be the same treatment because it's the same origin. It has to be the same
Right.
treatment, whether it's the spine, whether it's the skull, whether it's the abdomen, whether it's whatever.
And one thing's going to affect the other end of the thing.
That's it. So, but
Alright.
the importance of the importance of this uniform treatment and the system which functions as a uniform, like the national grid,
Right.
that means that your household and Graham's household, right? So whether it's the elbow, whether it's a skull,
Right.
they have to fit with their
they're
standards
within the
into this system.
Right.
So I think that's a very important message that we really want to pass on, and we'll get
Take a
onto
break.
it after it.
All right.
That was great. That was great.
And Leon is on camera. Can I just say, Steve, I don't remember you ever hearing you ever talk before about, I'm sure you have, this interdigitation. And to me, I love that moment in this presentation because what do? We keep going back to the basic model, moving it, looking at it, feeling it. What can this structure, we keep trying to unpack it, and this fact that you saw this interdigitation in the model and you thought, well, if it's not there in the body, then this is not going to hold up. And that was so very early on. I loved that moment.
Every once in a while you get one of these insights that just sort of fit. And I said, well, I was always trying to say, well, is this model right for it? So I'm always testing the model. And this was one of the things that I was consistent in the model, is this overlapping. And I started getting into things like the knee, where you don't really, it doesn't really overlap much until you add the patella and the fibula there. And all of a sudden you see that multi-dimensional kind of thing. And the important other aspect of it is that when you get this interdigitation, it doesn't make any difference which way you turn the structure upside down, right side up, sideways. It doesn't make any difference. That relationship always exists. And without it, the tensegrity model doesn't work.
So it's another relationship that is not gravity dependent.
Independent of gravity, it just is there.
Leonid, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Well, I mean, wait, where do I sound from? From here. Yeah. Oh, can you hear me? Yes.
We can see it too.
Oh, wait, now it's something new. Ah, shit.
We can.
Somehow it disappeared.
And people can put their hands up, do the little hands up thing in Zoom if they have comments too.
Oh, it's the phone that falls asleep. I see.
Open your videos too, if you wish.
No, I mean, okay. So I mean, it's the phone that just falls asleep after a while. Okay, so yeah, I mean, look, of course, I obviously have things to say, and I think that one of the most important things would be this the uniformity of the approach. So the thing that I was trying to highlight at the end of the video, so that this is really something very, very important, because in medicine everything is the opposite, right? So everything has its own treatment, so that this is special, this is special, this is special, this is special, and the key thing with biomechanics that it actually goes with it, right? So you see, it basically takes the shape as it is, and that's why it provides a different treatment for the elbow, for the shoulder, for whatever. And I think that this conversation that we had through this particular session, it was very important in this highlighting the uniformity, so that like we have to be looking at everything through the same lens. So the same irreducible volume, the same type of the balances, and which is, of course, is a very much challenging if you have the anatomical background. So, because to see, for example, the elbow, the shoulder, and the head through the same light and try to see what's the commonality, that's not easy. So, and that's really what kind of, I think, is one of the challenges in the, on the one hand, it's one of the great potentials, but on the other hand, it's one of the great challenges in delivering the, delivering the entire message. Yes. Or do I hear something?
Steve, any response?
To me, it goes back to the treatment that I keep talking about in these things. If your neck hurts or your foot hurts or your ankle hurts, it may be the same pathology, of at least dynamical pathology, that we're seeing. And so essentially the treatment's the same. So that, some of you, it doesn't make any, so Graham does his cranial sacral work on these little joints up in the head, but it's part of the same kind of mechanical system if you're working on the knee or the lower spine. It doesn't make any difference. The basic mechanics will be the same. And, if you then have to take it down that these same mechanical processes are going on at the cellular and subcellular level and at the fascia level, if you want to call it that those little things are happening all the time at the same level, so that when Gimbot Toe sticks his scope in there and he looks at it, you have to understand it's doing the same thing at that level that it does at the gross level or the subcellular level. And it makes life in some sense simpler, not more complex.
Another thing I love in this video is just all the stuff with Timothy Allen and the system science. I mean, a lot of people are aware of the Scientific American article that Dr. Ingber did in, was that 98?
98, yeah.
But here you have pages in this amazing book, Toward a Unified Ecology, that Timothy Allen did. They came out in 1992 and just came out as a second edition a few years ago. For anyone who's on the email list and got the newsletter, do yourself a favor and follow through on those links that are related to that book. And I linked to a couple of lectures on YouTube by Dr. Allen. And I'll have to say, so in 2019, I got the pleasure of meeting him, and it was a sort of mini sandbox meeting. That's his little kind of think group. I don't know what you want to call that. And I asked him, you know, who you put this in your book, this stuff on biotensegrity in 1992, and you've mentored all these people in your years as a systems science biologist, complexity biologist. Is anyone working with it? And he said, no one that he knew of was working with it. So for anybody who's interested in the future of research where biotensegrity is concerned, there is a huge amount to do going forward. So anyway, Timothy Allen is a delightful, wickedly funny person.
A very special person. And if you want to get to him, you have to bring a bottle of single malt scotch.
Which I did.
That's it has to be single malt scotch.
And then he also has an excellent book on hierarchy that he wrote with his wife. It's he just knowing who he is and his work. I've been looking at his papers again recently. It's just a treasure trove.
Yeah.
So thank you.
It was really serendipity that I just interfaced with him, and it worked out. And as I said, we carried on a relationship for many years, back and forth. And I go up to University of Wisconsin once or twice a year, and actually it was a dual thing. There was a meeting up there on manual medicine where I would talk, but I also would then go into his courses and give lectures to his graduate students. It was really a lot of fun.
Raised hand.
And
Hands up. Have a hands up from Bob.
Bob.
go ahead, Bob, unmute. Yeah. And I'll also say I got to meet some of the manual medicine people when I was in Madison too, Stephen. It's just a delightful group of people, two groups that have been following your work for decades.
Yeah, Steve, I enjoyed your comment or the principle of interdigitation, because it rang a bell with me with something that I've been experiencing lately. Studied more in depth the embryology of fascia and how the body develops in different layers, and was studying about how the trunk develops first, and then the arms and the limbs develop differently, and that the fascia of the arm, the appendicular fascia, blends in between the panicular fascia, which is more superficial, and the apical fascia, which is kind of the layer below that. But the way that it blends in between the two layers, it has to be interdigitated. And that's what seems to make the most sense, and been treating that at how the appendicular fascia, as it develops out, becomes the intermuscular septa. And so trying to treat the restrictions that you're finding in the arm, with that in the scapula has led to a whole lot of cleaning out a whole lot of more chronic things that weren't resolving before. But thinking about, how does it attach as an interdigitated system makes a whole lot of sense. And you can see how once it clears out, everything moves more smoothly.
So that's great. That's the interdigitation happening at a much different scale or level. in the body then. So that's a great insight, Bob.
Yeah.
And that's why it's kind of like layers, well, or
Yeah.
densifications, or go ahead,
Yeah.
Steve. Sorry.
Yeah, so I say you have to give it this layer stuff, because the layers always, there is no separation in the body in layers, that everything overlaps everything else. So you can't just separate it in shears that shear past each other, because there is no shear in the body.
Although we don't have good words for it. So I understand you talking about it that way, Bob. But what you're saying, Bob, is that you're kind of saying that this is evidence that there are no layers, further evidence, because you're looking at that interdigitation between what are perceived to be layers.
Yeah, I think that that's true. It all has to interact in some place, and has to, you need, I would think, again, as the arm is attaching to the skeleton, it needs to be, it needs to be flexible, but it also needs to be anchored somehow, so that it provides the stability. And I think the interdigitation down at the level it attaches provides the stability. And then once the layers, or then move on each other, that's what gives you the flexibility that you want out of the upper extremity.
Yes, and stability and flexibility and inherent part of tensegrity.
Yeah, see, there's a problem with our terminology. And words like attach, and the word itself implies that these are separate parts that are somehow attached with organic glue. And Bob used the word blending, and it's really, the biotensegrity starts with one cell and all of the tissues emerge over time. So words like attach and attachments and even ligaments all derived from cadaver anatomy in the 1600s. And when we really look at the body as a dynamic living system, it's all just merged in many layers and levels, and one part, like muscles and ligaments and tendons, grow out of the bones and grow into the bones. And so this is what I've been playing with, is trying to describe movement without using some of those limited cadaver-based terms. And it's been fascinating, just as a learning experience, and to really refine my biotensegrity thinking.
Steve, if I can jump in, I think that's a good point. And I guess the way that I might rephrase that, based on what you said, is that, embryologically, when it gets to that stage where the limbs start to develop, well, it's the extension of the system that's already existing, which then, permeates further and doesn't really attach. So I think that's a
Right.
good point. So thank you.
Yeah, that's exactly the point, is our basic terminology and concept of the body, of individual bones and muscles and tendons and ligaments and so on, all derives from 16th century anatomists, and cutting bodies into parts and then labeling and describing the parts. And what we're really moving toward with biotensegrity is a truly integrated science of living systems, seeing the dynamic interconnections at all levels. And so, again, I found it remarkably useful to be fairly rigorous about avoiding those tricky terms and concepts.
Can I jump in, Susan, with a quick tech request? And that is, Susan, will you please switch your view to gallery?
Yes, thank you. And Yasmin, you've got your hand up. Are you able to unmute?
Yeah,
There?
I've unmuted. Thank you, Susan. It's great to be back. It's been a while. And I really just resonated with that last conversation around holism, how, Steve, you talk about treatment, and whether it's craniosacral or whether it's movement-based or manual therapy-based, how it's shifted towards everything moves. And that comes back to you, Susan, how you talk about how everything moves. That's really helped me in my practice to recognize that that phase change that, I'm using the word phase change, that happens in the whole, and how the work of biotensegrity, I know for me, has really helped me to dive into this inner landscape in a way I would never have experienced before. So just coming back to this and hearing Steve again, it brings home the importance of sharing this. And we're a small group here, but how do we expand? So I just wanted to honor that last segment. So thank you.
Thank you. Diane? Diane, you're not unmuted. I mean, you need to unmute.
Again?
There we go.
Yes, about our taxonomy. The movement world of Levin and Blyum has been using other means for a while now. For example, rather than talking about flexion and extension in the body, we might talk about folding and unfolding, about gathering and scattering, ways of describing what is happening in front of you without putting it into that series of functional patterns that we are very familiar with from all of our study, and which are perfectly useful in their own way, but they don't tell us much about the movement. So there are words that do tell us about this movement. They go on and on. Let me just ask something about the idea of interdigitation. Graham, Scott, and I had a little chat on this about cross-linking. The idea that one of the things I like to say is that stretching is a blunt instrument. To stretch and put it in the lineup that we've taught, we have to put your hamstring in a certain arrangement so that it will be stretched. When in fact, there are a lot of things happening in a position like that, and to really integrate them and think of them as a whole part of the body, we have to look at cross-linking, how things are linked one to another. So does anybody want to say anything about cross-linking?
Well,
I guess my question would be, what is the distinction between interdigitation, or the relationship between interdigitation and cross-linking?
I don't know that I don't know that there is a distinction. They are both about relationships. The cross-linking might be more specific if you want to focus on a certain body part, but
maybe the structure of interdigitation is what allows, what enables, what facilitates for cross-linking. But
maybe
I will defer to Graham, Steve, Leonid.
But shall we allow Michelle? She has raised her hand. Oh.
Yeah, Michelle, is it about this question of cross-linking and interdigitation, or something else?
Something else.
Okay, so yeah, let's.
I was.
Oh yeah, thank you. I mean, of course, I want to hear what Michelle has to say, but I just want to. I'm wondering if Graham, Leonid, Steve, do you have any thoughts on this relationship between interdigitation and cross-linking?
I really don't know what stretching is. I mean,
right.
we change our body relationships and reconfigure the body, but I'm not sure we stretch anything.
Right.
And so, so I think that I think we have to rethink what we mean by stretching. And I think it's still phase changing more than anything else. We go from, a more solid phase to a more liquid, more fluid phase, that kind of thing. So I think those are the kinds of things we're doing. And when you're talking about cross-linking, I think it's more expansion and contraction of this structure that's doing this and doing this rather than stretching in the concept of a rubber band stretching.
Yeah, and for anyone who's seeing this and has not yet seen our discussions on stretching that are that they're up in the archive YouTube channel. There are several discussions because the word is older than some of the current physiological or physiotherapy definitions. So the word stretching. So thank you. Anybody else on interlinking and interdigitation? Graham?
With cross-linking, certainly at the molecular level, collagen fibers can cross-link with each other and other molecules as well, and that will contribute to the phase changing from the soluble, the liquid to more solid state, although neither of those it's soft matter, but certainly cross-linking at the molecular scale, and because collagen fibers are really quite long, they transition from the molecule to the micro scale because of the extracellular matrix and fascia. So certainly not a lot is really known about cross-linking, or not as much as I'd like to know anyway.
Thank you. Good.
And
Yeah,
it's fascinating, and I think it has to do with Jan's work too, with the scar healing, right? Because you've got something that's maybe over-linked, cross-linked. Do you know what I mean? And you're trying to release or get some of that to dissolve and reconfigure. Who knows?
I've never actually thought about that, but I'm going to. I'll come back to you. If I get any blinding insights, I'll come back to you on that one. Thank you.
All right, Michelle, thank you for waiting.
No problem. Do you hear me?
Yes.
I come back about what Steve said about systems, because I want to know if when it said Tensegrity system, it means specifically fascia system, because we have a problem with the word fascia in the nomenclature. In the nomenclature, actually, bones are not included in fascia system. So could we use another word about fascia system as a mesokinetic organ, for example, or I don't know. What do you mean? What should be the best? Because I will speak in a congress, fascia congress, in next year, and of course, for me, fascia system includes bones, and I can argue about this. But perhaps we could propose another word about the Tensegrity system. Is it mesokinetic organ, for example, which would be better?
Yeah, well, Graham and I introduced that term to talk about the locomotor system as the mesokinetic organ. But of course, when you talk of fascia, you're talking of there's parenchyma, which are the cells, and then fascia, which is everything outside the cells, as far as I'm concerned. So that would include bone and fluids and whatever connects everything else together. So I don't have any problem with it. I see a difference between the visceral fascia and the mesokinetic organ, which is to do with the movement part of it, and the fascia of the organ systems, which are sort of protective, like around the kidney, or how the kidney functions is all part of a fascial system too. So it's but you're all blending everything into each other again, and once you start getting back in the systems, but you can see these separate systems interlinking again. So that you have to just understand it as, okay, we can talk about the mesokinetic organ, the system that creates movement. But then again, you can't do that without the cellular component of the muscles, which is a parenchymal system. So they overlap. You can't, everybody's trying to cut this up in little pieces. You can't do it without recognizing that you're doing it. And that's one of our problems. We don't recognize that we do it. So the fascia people think that this fascia is completely separate, and then they start putting some fascial cells in there, which make no sense to me at all. But they're there; they're part of the muscle system. Why is a fasciocyte or whatever it is different than a muscle cell? It's just in one sitting someplace. So these things you just have to understand they're all the same. They're all the same, but they're all different. There's specializations within an organism, but they're all part of the same organism.
Can we get some clarity on a couple of terms though? Anyone who's got a 6-strut tensegrity handy, if you hold that up, or any tensegrity, that is a system. Okay, because the sticks and the strings sitting on the table by themselves don't have that systemic relationship. But those same materials, once they're in this very specific tensocompressional relationship, become a system and function as a system. They function differently, they respond differently, they move differently, they behave differently than they do when they're not connected in this very specific way. So that's one thing about system. And the other thing is, and this came up in Chris and Gwen's, thank you everybody for holding up your tensegrities. I feel like the old, there was an old television commercial in the US when I was growing up, and a car was going down the street and they'd say, "Show us your larks," which was a kind of cigarette. And all these people would pull their cigarette package out of their shirt pocket and hold it up, or pull it out of their pocketbook. I feel like, show us your tensegrities. But the other thing is that, so in Chris and Gwen's embodied biotensegrity meeting recently, which is a really excellent platform for anybody who's wanting to continue more serious conversations about this stuff, we were talking about fascia is a very historic word, right? Somebody comes up with this word and, starts applying it. And then over time, they think, well, this should go in with that too. This should go in with that too. And then they're trying to adjust a definition on a word.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And so you're trying to fix something that was kind of broken before you started, or that wasn't the way that emerged in the language, right, was not to serve the thing we are looking for it to serve now. And it's almost like we need to, throw it all in the trash and come up with a new word or something. Anyway.
That's called the legacy systems, right?
Say it again. Talk about that, Leonid. Tell me what
officially all that is called legacy systems, right? So you see, and that's really one of the main problems everywhere, right? So you see, to deal with the legacy systems, because when something, whatever, a field, a subset of anything, when it emerges, even the new words like now, right? So like artificial intelligence, what is being meant by this, right? So you see, and then all this language, which now comes into much broader use, it has been derived by somebody in very, very narrow niches, and actually was done with a very, very narrow intent. And
so
then suddenly...
Leonid, so this is the car being referred to in the early days as the horseless carriage.
Exactly. So that is also that's one of the, you see, look, I must say that the time when I was most impressed with this, like the story of the legacy systems, was when I, on a plane, and actually it was an Emirates plane, and they have a British CEO who speaks in a very posh, language, and he was talking about the fact that in fact, since aviation industry was the first one to introduce kind of the computer systems, like whatever they have, this Galileo and some other ones, for booking and for everything else. So which happened like 40 years ago, and they didn't have the uniform hardware, they didn't have uniform whatever. So, and in fact, it was built there, and there were other things which emerged in the other fields later, but they couldn't cancel those because they were working. And as this kind of the whole kind of computer world has been growing, they've been patching up and fixing and trying to expand the systems which were never really designed for this. And this is the greatest problem that they have, is like, by right, you should stop and start from scratch. But you can't, because you have a major kind of day-to-day use running on this. And effectively, this is the same thing, right? So you see, I really like the comment from Stephen, from Steve Schafferman. So when he said that I started using a lot more rigorous language and I benefited from it. And this is really a very difficult thing, right? Because, what I was listening very attentively, and what we are trying to do is that, okay, is it, are those layers or not layers? Is it interdigitating or is it cross-linking? How we're going to describe the spatial relationships and so on. But the fact is, what we are having as our model language, it's the engineered language. So it's the language which is designed for their systems which have like identifiable labeled units, and then something is being made out of them. We deal with an organism which runs on the scales of billions and trillions and whatever, so it means that it's not labelable, if you wish, right? And there are so many issues, and even in your example, okay, so the struts and cables lying on the ground, and now we're connecting them into the system. Again, that's not how nature works, right? So you see, it basically goes through the internal emergence. It doesn't have those parts which would be kind of connected afterwards. So, and this is really the essential problem, because look, on the one hand, we all enjoy each other's company, right? But but there are 17 of us on this particular meeting, and I know maybe within a year we'll get a kind of couple of hundred views for this, right? But if you recall the first phrase from one of the first phrases from Steve there, so in 1982, so on the 21st of September, which is like 41 years ago, almost to the dot, right? So you see, he went to the engineering conference in Houston thinking, hey guys, here is the gospel, things are going to be simple ever since. Just kind of, look, here is your heart, here is your whatever, here is it. And well, where are we? 41 years later, we're still scratching the head equally intensively in terms of trying to find the language of how we're going to communicate it, and how we're going to cross this chasm of actually making it sort of practical and accessible, and also kind of capable of changing their everyday reality, right? The reality of the practical use. So that's, of course, like a mega challenge that we are facing. And I keep coming up with new ideas, right? And again, fundamentally, the big solution there is that we have to move from label anatomy to, like classical mechanics was labeling bodies, labeling elements, and so on. And then about 100+ years ago, it moved towards statistical mechanics. So we have to make a move at some point to what could be seen as the statistical anatomy, and maybe some kind of swarm anatomy, right? So you see this kind of, anatomical intelligence anatomy. So there has to be a lot more anatomies than what we have. And on the other hand, like this other thing that we really facing, and I think that that's really a critical part, is what actually we talked about a few days ago, is that we have a mechanical thinking, and we kind of put the time factor as a secondary one. We try to represent time through the structures, like we talk about structures as if they were extractable from time, right? From processes, right? But the key point is once we start talking about processes, every process has a built-in clock. So that's why, that thing that, Bob was talking about, the interdigitation. And I think that in that sense, it's actually the way, speaking of clocks and built-in clocks, that's what potentially solves this distinction between layers versus the fact that there are no layers in the living thing. So, because when the clocks stop, you do see the layers emerging, right? But on the other hand, still, even in that potential capacity to move from clock to clock, they have different paces, right? So you see, they do have different increments at which they work and so on. And in that sense, the time matters, right? The time and timing matters, right? So you see, and the prior history matters, which creates a certain preferences, and which element is going to be, or which process is going to respond more likely. So, and as long as we understand that the word layer is kind of being a code word, a shortcut word, right? Which is not just a structure itself, but being sort of a code word at sort of tip of the process, which reflects the process and the clock underpinning it. So we can potentially use it, right? Because it's, it really gives us some, some shortcuts and some more usable codes that we can communicate to each other with. So that's, I believe, if we talk about the big directions, one direction is this: we have to go towards expansion, which is from classics to statisticals, right? So you see, mechanics undergone this like 100+ years ago. So, and we still don't have a statistical anatomy. And the second thing is that we have to move from machines to clocks, right? So you see, that's really the two big understandings that have to be happening, because otherwise we'll be stuck with those legacy things, right? And again, what Michelle was trying, okay, so how am I going to sort of change the nomenclature? Unfortunately, I don't think there is any good answer for this, right? So you see, because nomenclatures are being established by people who have been establishing them for generations, right? So, and they only, they're not going to change their legacy framework. They might accept some cosmetic adjustments, but not any major kind of overhaul and the transformations. So that's the way I see it, right? Is that I think that overall, within the mechanical and the structural language, we can, it could, refining and getting more rigorous and so on could help. But we still need to really use a lot of experiential oils, if you wish, right? And for this type of cooking, because otherwise it wouldn't get cooked.
This is such a great phrase that you've given us, Leonid, to understand that these terminologies are legacy framework terminologies. I think that's what Steve Schafferman was talking about too, that we want to increase our awareness with our own critical thinking skills and such of when we are kind of stuck with or getting funneled into almost a vice that is constructed of this legacy framework terminology. And the other phrase, Leonid, that I love is the AI as anatomical intelligence. It's not discussed enough, and this is a wonderful concept for us to be working with too.
Yeah, I do think so.
Yeah.
Because it's also, you see, kind of, it comes with, you know, it plays well with the idea of the swarm intelligence, right? The swarm intelligence, which comes from whatever, you know, the swarms of whatever, wasps, ants, and all this kind of popular things. So where there is a collective emergent, whatever, will, purpose, adaptation, and so on, whilst individual participants of this, or, you know, of an ant colony, they don't know the purpose, right? So you see, they serve, you know, they're really being like matter units which have a very limited kind of spectrum of the adaptive responses that they could have. So they could be like reduced to a very simple coding, if you wish, right? But if you start getting this swarm connections going together, then as a collective entity, the ant colony could behave in a very, very complex way. So, and that's what I think is a very important thing, which is completely missing from anatomy and from the attempts to kind of keep it as an dumb, unindexed, completely passive structure, which then would be sort of animated by the signals which are arriving either via electric or via the chemical avenues. But the moment we get this understanding that matter computes, and the anatomical matter computes in a rather complicated and in a rather complex way, so that we have to see this kind of emerging swarm intelligence. So I think that these are the dimensions which have potential. And you know, on the other hand, we just have to understand that, you know, like any metamorphosis, we have been really shackled by the cocoon of the legacy imagery, language, and, you know, like perspective of what's possible and what's impossible, and so on and so on. And the same way as whatever, the famous butterfly coming out of the cocoon really doesn't resemble the the previous stage.
Yes.
That's where we're eventually heading, I believe.
So I would encourage anybody watching, listening to check out on YouTube. There are complexity presentations. And if you look at active matter, I think that's related to this swarm intelligence. That's another kind of way to get at what's going on. Were you
Yes.
saying something, Steve?
Yeah, small world network is also part of that concept. And one of Buckminster Fuller's great talents, and he had many, of course, was his ability to make up names of things. So tensegrity, you know, he would do this, he would get a new word, he would make a new word to get a whole new concept going. And this was one of his great talents, and it is sorely missed in this group, because that's exactly what we need. We need people who can make up new words for these things.
No, maybe we should give ourselves the permission to be more brave with that, right? So rather than just, you know, like trying to fit the legacy things, right?
Well, yeah, well, Biotensegrity was, I mean, it sort of just came up, but it actually, Biotensegrity is a distinct entity from tensegrity. It's not exactly the same, because except Fuller thought of it in the sense of this, you know, going a hierarchical scales to subatomic levels, but applying it to biologically gives a whole new concept to biology. And so it works. And I actually thank my son-in-law for that work, because he was the one who did it. But you know, it's what Lena was talking about. Sometimes we just need to get new words, and we have to stop being afraid of doing that. And I mean, it's sort of a miss Buckminster Fuller, who was so great at that.
Right? We've
Yeah,
got
he
to back
also-
up.
yeah,
We've got
he
to back
was
up
also
on hands up. So,
repurposing words.
yeah, that's true. All right, we've got lots of hands up, lots of hands up. Craig, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right.
Don't speak too quickly, Craig. Okay.
Okay, so about at the first big conference in France in 2010, I introduced some pictures where I had the body without any labels at all. But I'm not practicing. I'm not a practitioner. I don't treat anyone. I don't engage with anyone. So I haven't been using labels for 15 years or so. And that's freed me from having to use legacy concepts. And literally it's taken 15, 20 years of not using those concepts to start to be able to use new concepts and think of new ways of doing things and not being tied into the description. Because anatomy, when you flex and extend, you are automatically locked into the legacy mode, and it's almost impossible to escape from the concepts. Recently, I can say that I've cleared up my concept generation, and I've already closed the circle now, and so I'm going to be producing some new work, shifting the paradigm entirely. And what I've noticed is that most of major shifts in science are related to simply describing the space we exist in. For example, the space around us is just open and everyone doesn't see it as any value, but then at some point that space, ordinary space, is described in certain ways mathematically. For example, in the old days, the Greeks, things were geometric, describe things in circles, squares, and lines. And then with Descartes, we came up with algebra. So we started to use algebra to describe the mathematical concepts. And from Descartes 400 years ago, we end up with what we now use is we call 3D. So we're talking about 3D volumes. That's the difference. It's just a mathematical description of the space we exist in. And then in Einstein's general relativity, he pointed out that the space we exist in isn't absolute, and it changes as we move. That concept, again, is changing our perception of our space around us. And these are fundamental constraints that are placed on our thinking. So I'm redescribing space now in a different way, totally, using topology change. So you can link the topology to biotensegrity through the icosahedron, which then relates to the pentagon. And the pentagon descriptions go back to Leonardo da Vinci, which was really a dead end that never really expanded into, it never became mainstream. So I'm just saying that you can't, if you're practicing and discussing and describing things with colleagues, it's very difficult to step out of the legacy descriptions. And so hopefully within a few months we'll have some new descriptions entirely free of legacy, and then we'll see where that takes us. And it requires new terminology, so entirely. So describing space is a topology It relates to points. Mathematics now, the point has no properties. It's just a point in space. But I think that when we look at the body, if we describe points as topological structures that have got structures, have got properties, it changes the entire dynamics of mechanics and space we're moving. And when we redescribe the space we're moving in terms of biology and biological systems, which we can see, we haven't labeled yet, that's where I'm personally moving, and I'm proud to share it with anyone who's interested in the next few months.
Great. Thank you.
So that was heavy lifting.
Go ahead, Steve Schafferman.
So before I mentioned the problems with the term attach and how it implies separate parts somehow attached with organic glue or some other means, another very problematic term is joint, which immediately implies that things are separate and joined. One of the ways that I've, for many, many years, have been thinking about movement and such is looking at muscles as a dynamic system like an elastic suit. And every movement is a reconfiguring of the whole elastic suit. Some places shortening, other places lengthening. And this elastic suit has some rigid bits embedded within it that we call bones. So again, part of the challenge is to begin by being very rigorous in rejecting the old language and terminology, which, as we've discussed, comes from cadaver science, and the fact that cadavers don't breathe and cadavers don't move and cadavers don't think and they're dead. And we have to learn to be fairly rigorous in seeing ourselves and all living beings as living beings. So in third term that I've been really rigorous about avoiding is anatomy. And the word means to cut things into parts. And the alternative term to anatomy is one we all use regularly on this forum, which is biotensegrity. And that's why I think it was just very insightful and foresightful of Steve to not try to trademark or patent the term biotensegrity, but to really present it in the most general sense. One other thought, my mentor, Moshe Feldenkrais, often talked about the danger of trying to think in words. He said, talking is not thinking. Real thinking is making distinctions experientially. And real thinking leads to new ways of acting. And someone else who was quite explicit about the problems of thinking in words was Einstein. And there's a letter that he wrote about his way of thinking and the fact that his thinking, as he described it, was of the muscular kinesthetic type. And then it was very laborious to try to put his thinking into words in order to communicate. So these are the paradigm shift challenges that we're all living with and muddling our way through, and applauding all of us for staying in the conversation and being willing to keep muddling even when we're not sure where we're going. And that, for me, is the true paradigm, is the way very young children learn to walk and talk and make sense of the world by just exploring and figuring it out, guided by curiosity and comfort. So I liked Leonid's term swarm intelligence. I use the term cell intelligence or cellular learning to see how individual cells are actively making sense of their environment. So just some more thoughts for this soup.
Thank you, Stephen. And pop in here for Susan. And the nice thing is that we have this community to share these inquiries with, and this development of a new language. Now I'm looking at the time. We've got Diane and Carol So why don't you go first, Diane, and then Carol?
Okay, thank you. The term swarm intelligence, a wonderful term. There's an article in the August 28th New Yorker called Hive Mind. And it says, is beekeeping wrong? And it's about the intelligence, it's about swarm intelligence of bees, and it's terrific. I highly recommend it. I'm reading it, and all I can think about is Biotensegrity as I read through this. So this was great because they speak about how bees are wild creatures. It doesn't matter if you have a hive with it or you find it in the hole of a tree. These are wild creatures, and they do the thing they do. They sort of go along with what we'd like them to do, but and we take their product, right? And we do all kinds of things to them, but they are wild creatures, and their whole world is about swarm intelligence. So I highly recommend.
Thanks, Diane. One of the things I like about the applied biology, what's your course called, Mariana? For physiotherapists, is the emphasis on moving from that machine intelligence to nature. We are nature, which is basically what you're saying, Diane. Go ahead, Carol. And
thank you. Thanks, Chris. I love this. I love this conversation about language and word choice. My father was a writer, a journalist. We were riding in the car one day, and I was talking about something, and I used the word continuously. And he said, "Do you mean continuously?" And I said, I think so. What are you getting at? And he says, "Well, there's a difference between the word continuously and the word continually in English. Now, which one do you mean?" And I said, "Well, I don't know the difference." And he said, "Then you won't know whether what you're saying is accurate enough or not." And he said, "Do you mean without any gap in the middle? Or do you mean with moving and then stopping and then moving again and then stopping?" And I said, "I mean moving and stopping and moving and stopping." He said, "Well, then you mean continually." And I thought, oh, Lord, how am I ever going to remember that? And he was very precise about word use. He would teach young journalists about the words that they were using. And I looked out the window, and we were driving through the valleys of Pennsylvania with the hills and the valleys. And I thought, continually has a valley in it. And that association always helped me to remember to use that particular word of the millions of words that I have, not for that concept, but that particular word had an association with it. When we use our words to reflect not only what we seem to know, it's also reflecting how we look at what we're describing, how we see what we're describing. But we often hope others will know what we mean. Like, "Oh, you know what I mean. You know what I mean." And that is just not good enough now, as this conversation has really articulated so well. We are in a paradigm shift. We are trying desperately to not only understand new concepts, but then be able to, in our understanding, describe how they're different from the way we used to think. And so when I want to change the concept of layers to densities, I know what I mean, but I'm hoping that you know what I mean by different densities rather than specific cutoffs between this and this and this, even though it looks like that on anatomical dissection. It looks like layers. Anytime we can cut it open, but Guimbarteau showed us that there aren't layers. There are only densities, different forms of fascia with different configuration and tightness versus looseness and so forth. And when I want to change the word stretch into elongation, and then I think, does elongation really, is that what I really mean to say? To elongate, is that what I mean to say? Or how about unfolding? Because the more I learned about what happens in the cellular structure of it folding over, collagen folding over on itself, and then I see my hands shifting as I press and then elongate. In my mind's eye, I can see that tissue unfolding itself, the collagen itself, and going back to the length that it was before it folded itself over. And unfolding seems so much more precise and accurate than elongation. But at the outside, it just looks like elongation. So
Crowell uses the term unfurling, furling and unfurling.
yeah, with a spiral, that's even better, I think.
It's
Yeah,
lovely. Yeah,
I love that spiral. So I believe we need a new language, a new vocabulary, of course. But I want to always keep in mind that when, as Leona has said, with the legacy system, we know what we seem to know what unfolding means. And then all of us says, well, what about unfurling? Oh, in my sailboat, my furling jib and unfurling jib. And that gets at that spiraling quality. But can we hope that other people will get that? Well, I don't know. Are you a sailor? Do you furl your jib? Furling kind of takes on a spiraling kind of notion. Can we count on other people getting that?
This is also the power of metaphor, right?
Yes. And in poetry, poets always ask that the metaphor be interpreted by the reader. Poets don't like to explain what they meant. They want it to have meaning for you. But we, in striving for accuracy, in striving for changing frameworks that were wrong, just out and out wrong, they were just wrong, we want to be a little bit more precise than poets. Metaphors work, I think, but I think we really have to be careful when we want to use language in ways that educate to a new way of seeing that we all agree is more accurate than the old way.
But Carol, I think we have to be careful about this yearning for a certain kind of precision and accuracy too. I mean, one of the strengths of poetry, right, is that it's in that the reader is left to that. So it's a delicate balance, right?
Yeah.
It's a delicate balance. It's great stuff. I think we are way over time, but let's hear from Bob, who's had his hand up.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Well, this is just a eye-opening conversation, so thank you, everyone. I love Leonid's point about the swarm intelligence. I think that's wonderful. I love Steve's conversation about the electric suit, and we're looking at it as a whole. But I do think we do need to remember that embryologically, the way the body forms is it does form in layers, and there are individual parts that then need to come together. And I think that brings the complexity in. So we start off individually, and then everything needs. I said that's when everything comes together, and that's where real problems can be. So I think I don't know that completely disregarding the term layer would make sense, but somehow integrating it into the entire conversation, I think is where that's how it all ends up, and we get to the holism, and we get to the swarm intelligence and everything else that we're discussing. So I think we got to remember where we start from, and then how we get to where we eventually end up.
I think some of you have my Everything Moves book, and when I was making the book, I realized I needed to make this cake. And this is a cake that you make, and so then you pour the batter into the pan, and then while it's cooking, it it changes the distribution of material so that when you take the cake out of the oven, and it changes not only the distribution, but the quality of the material. Okay, so it goes in as one thing, one batter. But then while it's cooking, there are densifications and different phase conditions that emerge. So when you take it out, you have kind of a crust on the bottom, you have a custard, you have a cake, and then you have a layer at the top that's got a kind of a crispier top layer crust, another kind of crust, different from the bottom crust. And so it's like, what is a layer? So we end up, but that's very different than a layer cake where I make the frosting, I make the cake, I build the cake. This one builds itself while it's cooking, builds those layers or quality differences and phase differences and condition differences itself. So it's tricky. And again, it's a language thing, right? Anyway, last comments. I'm going to give it over to Steve and Graham and Leonid.
Oh, I think that it's probably indeed it's time to get some toast raised, but let's hope that our conversations are going to get some next level of distribution. And well, I think that that's one of those things is that like to find a way how we can get out of our own layers, right? And sort of find a way to get the next level of unfurling into the into the like new and younger audiences as well, right? So this is something which we really need to find, to be thinking and finding this particular links, right? So, and I think that that's could be a toast to kind of wrap it up and hope that we'll find a way to make a bridge towards the younger generations.
Okay, are you toasting, Leonid? Go ahead.
I am. So you see, for the biotensegrity for the next generations and for the, greater waves through it.
All right, Gambe.
Definitely.